It's Thursday, July 7th. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. And yesterday, the NTSB released the full docket on the crash of Dale Snort Snodgrass's Siai Marchetti 1019B aircraft while on takeoff from Lewiston, Idaho, back on 24 July of 2021. And sure enough, the NTSB found that the flight control lock was in fact engaged on the accident aircraft at the time of the accident. The NTSB final report was also published yesterday along with the full docket, and the probable cause and findings are the pilot's failure to remove the flight control lock before departure, which resulted in a loss of the aircraft control and impact with terrain. Contributing to the accident was his failure to perform an adequate pre-flight inspection and flight control check before takeoff. Now going through the analysis of the final report, the pilot was attempting an intersection takeoff about midfield when shortly after the airplane became airborne, it pitched up aggressively, rolled left, and descended into the ground in a nose-down attitude. Examination did not reveal any evidence of pre-accident malfunctions or failures of the flight control system, and there was no evidence to indicate that the pilot's seat had moved. Both the engine and propeller exhibited damage signatures consistent with high engine power at impact. In other words, the engine and prop were working fine. The airplane was equipped with a flight control locking system that comprised of a pivoting U-shaped control lock tube mounted permanently to the rudder pedal assembly and a forward-facing locking arm mounted to the pilot's control stick. The control lock immobilized the aileron and elevator controls, but still allowed for near full movement of the rudder and tail wheel. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment. The cabin floor where the control lock tube should have been mounted for flight was severely deformed and compressed. Had the lock been stowed during impact, it would have been pinned under the flight control stick, crushed longitudinally, and its retaining clip would have been deformed. However, the control lock and its retaining clip were essentially undamaged, and the lock was found raised off of the floor. The locking arm on the control arm also showed no evidence of deformation or impact damage, but had rotated about 90 degrees to the right of its normal position, as if forced into that position on impact while the control lock was still engaged or attached. Given this information, it is likely that the control lock was installed on the flight control stick during takeoff and impact. The high-resolution security camera footage, which is in this report here, see the link below, of the accident revealed no discernible movement of the ailerons or elevators, further suggesting that the flight controls were immobilized by the control lock. Although the control lock is painted red, its orientation when engaged results in a pilot viewing it directly down its length at its narrowest profile. A pilot who owned a similar aircraft stated that he had once become distracted during pre-flight checks and was able to taxi, initiate a takeoff, and become airborne with the control lock engaged. And he stated that once he realized his mistake, he removed the lock. Removal of the lock was a struggle due to the forces imposed on the control stick during takeoff. That guy was able to disengage the control lock and continue flying the airplane. The pitch trim was found in an almost full nose-down position. This is electric trim on the Siai Marchetti, suggesting that the pilot may have been attempting to use the trim to arrest the airplane's increasing nose-up attitude due to the locked control stick. Whether the pilot recognized that the control lock was engaged or believed he had a flight control problem could not be determined. Regardless, after takeoff, during a dynamic and transitional phase of flight, there would have been minimal time to accurately diagnose the issue and disconnect the control lock. You can see, looking at the video, just how quick things unfolded. The intended purpose and destination of the flight was routine, and there was no apparent time pressure present. The pilot was reported to be extremely thorough about performing pre-flight checks, and according to his wife, the expected duration of his normal pre-flight activities would have not allowed him to depart when he did. In other words, there was a bit of apparent rushed time during this particular pre-flight and takeoff. The pilot had limited experience in the accident airplane, which could explain why he did not remove the control lock during the pre-flight inspection. Dale had just purchased this aircraft recently, and he had about a total of 20 flights in this aircraft so far. There was no video evidence to provide insight to the duration and the scope of the pilot's pre-flight inspection. However, omission of the pre-flight control check was uncharacteristic given his extensive flight experience, and the reason it was not performed could not be determined. While omission of the control check is consistent with a pilot rushing or distracted, and the short duration from taxi to takeoff would have reduced this pilot's opportunity to detect his error. The investigation was not able to determine the reason it was not performed. Had the pilot completed a functional check of the controls before initiating takeoff, the presence of the lock would have been detected and the accident would have been prevented. Although the pilot's autopsy demonstrated the presence of heart disease, which posed an increased risk of impaired or incapacitated cardiac event, heart disease is unlikely to have caused inattention. It is also unlikely that the pilot was incapacitated by a cardiac event because his final radio transmission showed that he was aware and speaking after the onset of the loss of control. Remember hearing that? Thus, it is unlikely that the pilot's heart disease contributed to the accident. Here's a view of the aircraft after the accident, and here is the flight control lock of the actual accident aircraft found forward, basically up towards the backside of the firewall, where it normally should be stored on the floor in this retaining clip. Here you can see the floor of the aircraft buckled, and if the control lock was properly stowed, it would have bent along with the buckling of the floor. Here's an example of how the control lock looks in a sample airplane, or it would have looked before the accident. The control lock mounts in a couple of blocks down here by the rudders, and these two tabs here stop the rudder itself from banging around in the wind. That's the whole idea of a gust lock, is to prevent the controls from banging around in a windy situation if the aircraft is parked outside. So it grabs the rudders right there, and up here outside of view, it attaches to the stick, which locks the elevator and the ailerons. Here's another view looking forward and a little bit to the right, and here is the arm that the control lock attaches to via this pin into this hole, and this arm is spun 90 degrees from the impact, spun on this collar around the stick, releasing the control lock on impact. Here's a view of the control lock from the pilot's perspective. Of course, this aircraft used solo from the front seat, and the control lock is installed in the front seat set of controls. With the control lock engaged in this position, you can see you're looking down the front of the control lock that's painted red. So with the control lock installed, how does one taxi this aircraft? There's apparently a little bit of play in the rudders with this rudder control lock in place. These cables are the rudder cables that move from the rudder pedals directly out to the rudder control horn located right here. From the rudder control horn, a pair of springs are attached and chains which attach to the tail wheel steering. In this example that the investigators used, this example aircraft, they had disconnected the tail wheel chains and are illustrating that with the control lock stowed, you can of course get full rudder control, and it looks like that. With the control lock installed, you can get some rudder, this is left rudder, and as a result, that chain would pull the tail wheel, and you could get some tail wheel steering out of the aircraft with the control lock installed. But with that and differential braking, heavy use of differential braking, other owners of this type of aircraft have investigated it, and yes, they were able to taxi the aircraft. Here's a statement from the instructor that was working with Dale on getting him checked out on his aircraft. Following the accident, Mr. Minetsky examined a 1019 owned by a friend, and he had the following observations. The airplane can be taxied uninhibited with the control lock installed. Of note, it requires very heavy differential braking to turn. He referred to the technique as heavy English, so often only limited rudder movement can be used. Also, you can climb into the cabin with the control lock installed. With the control lock installed and the airplane parked, you could not disengage it with reasonable force if there was any control pressure on the stick. It appears to be hung up on the pin until you release the pressure. You got to loosen up the pressure on the stick to get the control lock unlocked. The owner of that airplane performed a test flight where during takeoff he held the stick in a position that simulated the installation of the control lock. In other words, what position does the locked controls put the elevator in? This resulted in a similar takeoff profile to that observed in the video of the accident airplane. Again, he only simulated this and then relieved that pressure. While getting checked out in the aircraft, Dale and his instructor discussed the control lock operation, and Mr. Snodgrass stated that it was very similar to the lock used on his T-28, which he owned or used to own, and is common among military aircraft. Here's the excerpts from the Siai Marchetti manual, both on pre-flight checklist here, step 4, flight controls unlocked, and in the before takeoff check, just like any aircraft. Step number 5, flight controls check for freedom of movement and maximum range of travel in both directions. So many of us that fly a lot of different light aircraft like to use the CIGARS checklist. C is for controls, and that's the first step you do is sweep those controls. And that's the part many folks can't understand is Dale does this every time. He did every time in the F-14 flying off of a carrier deck. Why would it be any different on this day? Here the NTSB lays out the timeline. At 11:50:15, the pilot made initial contact with ground control at Lewiston. 8 seconds later, he requested taxi clearance from the FBO ramp for a runway 12 departure at taxiway Delta. So here's the FBO located right over here. Taxiway Delta. Runway 12 intersection Delta takeoff going this way. Of course, this aircraft needs very little room for takeoff. The controller then instructed the pilot to taxi via taxiway Delta at 11:50:48. While still on the ground frequency, the pilot asked if he was cleared for takeoff, and about 20 seconds later, after the controller finished communicating with another aircraft, the controller replied, "And cleared the pilot for takeoff from runway 12 at taxiway Delta." The pilot responded, and the controller requested that he switch over to the tower control frequency. After apologizing, the pilot contacted the tower controller. The tower controller confirmed contact with the pilot and cleared the airplane for takeoff at 11:51:41, so less than 2 minutes after he made his initial contact with ground control. The pilot replied for takeoff, and 36 seconds later, the accident occurred. Dale and his wife had flown into the Lewiston airport on the same day of the accident in their Aerostar aircraft, and then Dale was to take the Siai Marchetti to his new cabin that they were just finishing up. Beautiful new cabin at the Hungry Ridge Airport, shown here, just some 57 nautical miles away from the Lewiston airport. In her statement to the NTSB, the pilot's wife reported that before she left Lewiston that morning at about 11:10 Pacific Daylight Time, the accident aircraft had not been pulled out of the hangar. She said that normally the aircraft would have been pulled out of the hangar, and he would have then performed all of his outside checks, and then he would have performed all of his inside checks. She also stated that he was methodical and slow, and was surprised that he could have performed all his checks and had crashed by noon. She said that her husband liked to get up early and take short flights in the accident airplane. He likely had about 22 flights, and almost all of them were short flights. So what does this accident remind us? That this can happen to any of us, even if you're the world's greatest living fighter pilot flying F-14s for over 4,000 hours with 1,200 carrier landings. or just a regular guy flying out of the airport. Just a moment's complacency, distraction, or rushing of pre-flight duties can just lead to absolute tragedy. Thank you for your support, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.